This is Monica Perez here with a returning guest, a lawyer from Tennessee, Eric Buchanan, who has an uncanny ability to understand and study the Constitution and explain it to us all in ways that we can understand. He's also quite the student of history and can put these things in context. And that's just what we have in store for you today. So take a deep breath because we are laying down the law with Eric Buchanan. Hey, Eric, thanks for taking time out of your very busy schedule to be here today and for doing a lot of homework, I heard.
Yeah. Hey, Monica, how are you doing?
Great, thanks. I do like to tell people what you do, both to establish your credentials and also to let them know that there's somebody out there if they have this particular problem. Why don't you tell them what your firm is about?
Yeah, sure. Let me start with that. So, hi, everybody. My name is Eric Buchanan. I'm a disability insurance attorney in Chattanooga, Tennessee. My background very quickly was that I'm a history major at the Virginia Military Institute. Went to the Navy for 5 years as a P3 naval aviator, and then I went to Washington and Lee for law school, where I paid a special attention to constitutional law. What I do for a living is my firm helps people who have disability insurance problems. So if you have any problems with Hartford, MetLife, Unum, any of those companies that are not paying your disability insurance, you can find us on the World Wide Web at buchanandisability.com. We help people all over the United States. We have 5 attorneys. We'll work with local attorneys everywhere in the United States. We've done cases from Minot, North Dakota to Alaska to New York City is where we have the most cases filed right now. So somebody who has a disability insurance policy, long-term disability, long-term care, health insurance, and life insurance, that's our little niche. And we help those people all over the United States.
Well, that's excellent. And I hope people will keep you in mind if they need any of those services, especially since you do us such a great service at no charge here on Deep Dives. And so the best way to reach you, can someone email you through your website if they just have any random question? Are you
Yeah,
the
if you go to
guy?
the website, that's the best way to reach us. It's buchanandisability.com, and you'll find they'll contact us like a normal website.
Okay, awesome. So having more to do with your academic and intellectual pursuits, we are going to cover a topic from the past that absolutely is reaching into the present. You hear even the term a lot, but when I started looking into this just in preparation for being here to hear what you have to say, I was amazed at how little I knew about the populist movement, how its roots, its history, its implications. I picked up a few little tidbits along the way, which I will interject, but why don't you just start from what you think is the beginning?
Yeah, so the populist movement in the United States, let's stick with that time period when they actually had a party that people refer to as the populists. We'll kind of start with that. So basically our history lesson starts with the end of the Civil War and America starting to recover from that war. Something like 40% of the population of the United States were still farmers at that point. And the population of the United States was about 36 million, still pretty small. And to kind of put it in perspective, we just lost 600,000 people were killed in the Civil War. Think about that out of 36 million. That's a huge portion of the population was just killed.
I mean, it would be 10 times now.
Yeah. So what started happening after the Civil War in the 1870s is all these people went home from the war, started running their farms again. The economic system in the South had been totally disrupted. People were moving out west and starting these farms. And the short story of this is that the money supply in the United States was shrunk. In the 1870s, the Congress took the United States off of the silver standard and put us just on the gold standard. So during the Civil War, the United States government had actually issued greenback currency, just dollar bills that weren't backed by any gold. And that lasted until the early 1870s. And then Congress it's a whole separate story. It's a whole kind of a hidden story where how they snuck this into a law in 1873 and people didn't find out for a couple of years, but they refused to redeem the old notes anymore, and we went basically to a strong gold standard, and that was really good for big business and the people who had money. And if they wanted to loan money out, they could basically charge whatever interest rates they wanted because there just wasn't that money available. So the farmers who basically had gone back home after the Civil War and started farming again, here's like the list of problems they were facing. The McCormick Reaper and the other technology that was happening in the mid 1800s made it so that farmers were 5 to 10 times more productive for the same piece of land. You would think that would be great for each farmer, right? If he could go from 20 bushels of wheat to 200 bushels of wheat for the same acre, that's fantastic, right? Well, if every farmer is doing that, what's the law of supply and demand tell us?
Right. The prices are going to plummet.
Yeah, the prices are going to go down. So there was one problem with the prices going down. Another problem happening was that the because of the money supply, farmers didn't have a lot of cash. Once a year, you get to sell your crop, and if everybody else is selling their crop at the same time, you might get a pretty cheap price for it. So how do these farmers live throughout the year? It was called the crop lien system, and basically what you have to do is you go to the local general store, local merchant, and say, okay, I need a little sugar, a little coffee, I need, whatever I need for supplies to plant next year. You bought it all from the local merchant in town, and he would sell it to you on credit and then collect it at the end of the year when you sold your crop. There were two problems with that. Those merchants were generally charging very high interest rates, like 10, 15, 20, 25% interest. And they also had a separate price list for all their goods. So a bag of sugar, if you went in with cash, might be 3 cents. A bag of sugar, and that was big money, remember, in 1875 or 1880. But if you went in with having to borrow against your future crops, the price might be 7 cents for that same bag of sugar. So you might pay double for it and then pay interest on the additional 7%, on the additional 7 cents. So you're paying interest on all this money. So at the end of the year, when you sell your crops and maybe you get $300 for your crops that year, you go back to the merchant and he says, okay, well, that's great. You owe me $350. So we're just going to add that $50 to next year. And that kept happening year after year after year. And the way the farmers were basically guaranteed to pay it back, the way the merchants would secure the money, is they would take a lien against the farmer's crops. So the farmer didn't even have the choice to go grow a different crop, to try a different option, to try to sell it somewhere else.
So was there no way to ever get ahead of this? Like these guys could never sell the crops, save for 1 year. Like if you're always behind, if you just had $100 in the bank, you could get ahead of that process.
Yeah, so that was the problem, is there wasn't enough cash around for them to ever really get ahead. So the problems was the prices were dropping because the money supply was shrinking. When we went back on the gold standard, you end up with deflation. The prices were also dropping because productivity had gone up so much. Fertilizer was coming around that was better, but so were the mechanics, like the McCormick Reaper and some of the other technology that were happening. The combine that could do everything from cutting the wheat to shaving it and then stacking it. Essentially, that came out in the mid 1880s. A horse-drawn combine was the technology you can run with horses back then. So the bottom line was the farmers were extremely productive and were getting very little money, and they were having to borrow from the merchants. So the question they were asking themselves is exactly what you asked. Well, how do we ever get ahead of this? And so they started organizing, and they started coming up with the idea, well, maybe if we start our own stores, we could start co-ops. So the original co-ops were developed around that time. They also thought, well, what if we could find a place to store our crops once we harvest them, and that we don't have to sell them right away? If the prices are bad right now, why don't we store them when the prices are better?
Wasn't that East of Eden? Wasn't that the premise in East of Eden? Do you remember that one where the guy invented the refrigerator truck?
Yeah, that was part of it. That happened later on. The
Yeah,
original
but I
idea, though,
mean,
yeah,
that's the idea.
sure. So the original idea that farmers were having for wheat or cotton was they would have these big giant warehouses, and once they put their crops in the warehouse, they could then borrow money against that and then sell it when actually the price was up. And the idea was to actually have the government come in and pay for these big buildings and ensure that their crops, that they could borrow against it, and they would have low interest rates. So the farmers started organizing the Farmers Alliance, is what it was called. Go ahead.
Was this something like completely crazy to expect the government to do? Were they talking the federal government? It seems like the government was less interventionist back then, and that would have been like a real reach. Or am I wrong am I just projecting?
Yeah, no, so that's a great question. That's what's so interesting about the populist movement. So one of the ideas of the populist movement was for kind of the first time since the American Revolution, did a bunch of ordinary folks think, hey, this government's not working for us. Let's do something about it.
Hmm.
And so they started organizing and started basically they hired their own people to go around and educate other farmers. Go ahead.
I mean, I just feel like it undermines, totally turns on its head my idea that libertarianism is the founding principle of this country. Because if there was competition for that idea from the get go, like the government should actually have some affirmative responsibilities, I wouldn't think that that would be considered a federal thing. But it sounds like the idea was, people were open to this idea that there was a parental role of government potentially.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And so let me give you a short answer. If you talk to the bankers in New York, they would agree with you. We don't need to have government do this kind of stuff. If you talk to the guys who were running the railroads in the 1800s, we don't need the government to do this kind of stuff. If you talk to most business owners in the South, they would say we don't need the government being involved. If you talk to the farmers who were getting screwed, they were trying to come up with new ways of dealing with this. So after the Civil War, you had Reconstruction going on. You had the kind of the early phases of socialism, that Eugene Debs running as a socialist. That happened in the 1890s. That was well before the Communist Revolution.
Right.
So socialist ideas were going around. And what happened was these farmers basically started to organize. And when they came up with the original idea of let's do co-ops and let's see if we can pledge our own crops to fund these co-ops and maybe build our own buildings to store the money, store the crops, basically the merchants and the banks wouldn't deal with them. They tried to lock them out. They tried to keep their monopoly of being the ones that were loaning the money and charging these high interest rates of the farmers. So the whole idea of the Farmers Alliance started out with, well, let's try within the system that we're facing. Can we fight this system or have a better solution in the system to have co-ops where we can buy our own supplies and not be charged interest?
And as a libertarian, I try to think back, like if their fundamental problem was that the way money worked was wrong and the government was in control of that, or that was maybe unconstitutional, or the way banks got chartered, the way banks operated, or the way railroads got easements, I'm just trying to justify in my mind sympathizing with these guys by saying, well, it's not like these were just mom and pop entrepreneurship in business and banking and railroads that a free market would have cleared it. There were systemic problems that the government may be responsible for. And therefore, these farmers wanted turn to a government solution, because a free market solution wasn't even possible, because some of these markets, money, banking, railroads, were actually already influenced by government action.
Yeah,
possible?
that's a great point. And that's one of the arguments that we'll kind of get to in a little bit when we get to the Teddy Roosevelt version of progressivism. The idea that if the government has already created these protections, then maybe the government has some other responsibilities.
Yeah.
But
I have beef with Teddy, so.
I'm sorry?
I have beef with Teddy Roosevelt, so we'll get to that when we get to it.
Yeah, and that's maybe 25 years into this populist movement. So
right. I'm not going to derail you, I promise.
Yeah, so the populism movement really got going in the 1880s as these guys tried to do different things to form the co-ops, to form their own markets, to be able to store their own grain. And they kept running into the people who had the money wouldn't loan them money, didn't want to upset the system. The banks wouldn't deal with them. And so they actually started thinking, well, maybe the solution is we need the government to provide these opportunities and need to loosen the money supply, allow us to put our money in these buildings, and also regulate the railroads, because the railroads were also charging exorbitant rates. So the farmers, when they could when they could go ahead and sell their crops for a decent rate, they still had to pay a big fee to the railroads, because the railroads basically paid for or collected the money for the crops. No matter, like, you had to get it to Chicago, and whatever it cost to get it to Chicago, the railroad would charge the same rate whether you were sending it from Omaha or Topeka or Dallas. And so there was this kind of a monopoly that had happened. And here's the big kind of political argument: did it happen because it was a capitalistic system that was unregulated, Or did it happen because it was a system that was kind of a crony capitalist system where these big businesses had protection? And I'll throw this out here. It opens up the fair question: should a libertarian government at least have the role of breaking up monopolies? Where do
Oh,
you fall on
I'm
that?
gonna give you this. So first of all, the
Yeah.
railroad thing was just riddled with bad government policy, just riddled with. And the only railroad that really survived in the end wasn't that the Hill Railroad, where the guy actually went outside that system. I think they made perverse incentives with cheap bonds and overbuilt, and then there were all sorts of problems. Probably the East-West stuff, not necessarily what you're talking about now, but uh, so I would argue that there are no natural monopolies, none. And I'll tell you why I say that, because the only thing that could really be a monopoly is something that has no substitute. And the only things that have no substitute are not subject to scarcity. So, like the things that you need without substitute, food, water, shelter, clothing, those are really basically the only things you need. And because those aren't really scarce in the free market, in a free market, then anything else you can get around. So even roads, okay, if a guy wants to build a store and somebody else wants to build an apartment building, they can build the roads. Will they have monopoly? Well, they'll have monopoly between that, but you build yourself another store, you build yourself another apartment building, you build yourself another road. I mean, we could get to the nuances of it, but I've been thinking about this for a long time.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think those are good arguments. Here's what a farmer would have said to you in
Yeah,
1890.
good. What?
I make about $300 a year, and I go into debt about $350 a year. I'm not going to come up with the money to build my own railroad to get my
But
crops to Chicago.
but why is it like that? It sounds like there was an oversupply of food, of crops.
Well, so yeah, that's a big part of this story is that the United States after the Civil War began to see the advance of technology really play out in the agricultural industry. Let me just put it this way. If you go back to before McCormick's Reaper, which was invented in the 1850s, and really it wasn't until after the Civil War that you could buy them all over the country. So effectively around the Civil War, and McCormick's Reaper eventually was the company International Harvester. So that company started in the 1840s. Some people started using it in the 1850s. By the end of the Civil War, if you could borrow enough money to buy a McCormick Reaper, it could really dramatically increase your productivity.
And if you couldn't, you probably could not compete. The technology made obsolete the like hand to mouth type of farming. So maybe this was
Or
just the death throes of an obsolete system.
so there's kind of you could still barely make a living if you still used a plow and used a mule. My point was this: before the McCormick Reaper, the farming in the United States would have been the same. You wouldn't have to teach a Roman citizen in 200 BC any new skills.
Right. Okay.
They basically farmed the same way that the Romans had 2100 years earlier. That it was using a plow and
Yeah, the
planting the
plow
seeds
was the
that way.
pivot and
Right.
then the harvester.
Right. So what we had happened between 1860 and 1900 is a dramatic change in technology. And my analogy when we talk about this later today of where we are with the same kind of push for populism is think about the huge portion of the population in the 1950s and 60s that worked in big industry and could make a middle class living working in a factory. What happens when we as a nation stop being a factory based production system and instead become a service industry or a knowledge based industry? The same kind of transition was happening in the United States in the late 1800s. We were going from an agricultural country to an industrial country. And if your skill set was pushing a plow and growing cotton or growing wheat, you were becoming more productive, but so productive that we didn't need all of you, and the
Right.
value of the crops was going down.
I mean, a lot of times that actually means you spend more time doing something because it's so much more valuable. It's more valuable on the world market. So when they invented the washing machine, the hours a person spent doing laundry went up because now we wash our clothes every day instead of once a month. So, I mean, that may not even be true, but it gets the point across. So it's possible that if you could compete with other markets. And I would also wonder, I don't expect you to know the answer, but if there were systematic incentives for International Harvester or the McCormick Reaper to to get production out there? Did they get cheaper loans? And in which case you have subsidized tech and capital pushing out the little guy, fostering mega farms or big money farms, and that would change the political landscape, which I think is maybe where you head.
Yeah, well, I think the McCormick Reaper was eventually cheap enough that by the 1870s and 1880s, a whole lot of farmers in the Midwest could do it. But because the railroad system, you had commoditized the wheat and cotton, for example.
Mhm.
And the worldwide market for cotton had changed because during the Civil War, the British said, "Well, we can't rely on the South anymore, so
So it's Africa.
let's
Yeah.
go to Egypt, let's go to India," and they started growing cotton there, and it replaced the value of cotton in the 1870s and 1880s dropped dramatically, while the technology was getting a little better. For wheat, the technology got way better because of the McCormick Reaper fertilizer, and we had opened up the prairies, so there were these big giant areas where wheat could be grown. So a small wheat farmer couldn't really compete, and so what was happening was maybe a few rich farmers who were successful would go ahead and offer loans for these other farmers' crops, and they would use that money at the general store. But basically, they would get so far behind doing it that way that the big farmer would seize their land, would condemn it because they weren't paying off their loans. So you either got in so much debt that you owed the country store a bunch of money, or you got in so much debt that you end up losing your land to the big farmers, and you went from being an independent farmer who was not making any money to being a sharecropper who wasn't making any money.
This worries me because I have this crisis of ideology right now, personally, where I hear something like that and I think, well, I mean, I'm sorry, buddy, but the world will get fed better if we have this new technology. I mean, you could have an end to poverty if you can increase yields by 10 times. And that did happen with the green revolution of the 60s. And there's all sorts of problems with that. And maybe it didn't last, but to the extent it did alleviate poverty, it's a great thing. And if some people are displaced and have to go work in a factory instead of have their small farm, that's just the way the cookie crumbles. But as a person who now witnesses the dehumanization that happens when you upend a culture, and especially particularly when you separate people from the land, from creating their own food, it makes me think, as like my libertarian self says, that it's homo economicus, whatever, man is just an economic animal. But maybe the older I get, maybe just seeing the devastation of the Great Reset and the Build Back Better movements, that I want to save them. I want to go back in time and save those small farmers, but it's hard for me to reconcile my ideology with the fact that culture matters. And I also ask myself, is it possible to save a culture in the face of technology? I know like Chinese dynasties in the past had suppressed actual technology in order to preserve the culture because they knew it would change things so fundamentally that the system wouldn't work anymore. So, I'm totally against the government fostering technological change, but I certainly wouldn't want them to suppress it either.
Yeah, and so the technological change at the time was dramatic, which I'd like to talk about in a second. But let's just kind of wrap up where the populist movement was going. So they basically the farmers had that instinct that you had, and that was a big part of what this fight was about. We're a bunch of American farmers. We should have what Thomas Jefferson said is the foundation of America, which is all these European, all these yeoman farmers. We should have our small gentleman farms. We should be able to maintain our own standard of living and should be able to live this lifestyle. What they couldn't do is do that in the face of dramatically increased productivity, dramatically increased transportation opportunities, so that increased the competition. If you were a farmer in Tennessee, your wheat prices, you were now competing against farmers in Nebraska, not just farmers in the next county over, because of railroads commoditizing it, because it could be sent around. So they eventually came up with a system of, well, if the banks aren't going to let us borrow money in a different format when we organize, if we're not going to be able to build our own co-ops because we can't organize well enough to come up with enough cash, then the government should come in and save us. And they started talking about internally that we are a democracy. They started using democracy instead of republic. And they started essentially saying we should be able to influence, as the free members of this American society, the federal government should start getting more and more involved to help us save our lifestyle. That was a really bare bones kind of boiled it down what the populists were really trying to do.
What you're reminding me is that all the knock-on effects of bad policy. So let's say the East-West railroads, which were completely riddled with bad policy, overbuilding, all of that kind of stuff. If that would subsidize this commoditization that you're talking about, and not only that, but it would allow for these massive city centers away from the heartland, so that now we have what, like half the population lives in the coasts. And then you have problems with, people don't want the electoral college. They want the popular vote, all this stuff that was designed to allow for that kind of population lumping, that it wouldn't even be as much of a problem if that transfer. That's why I don't even like the interstate highway system. What it does is it subsidizes, it rests on a myth that the efficiencies, the economies of scale are so enormous that you only need like a couple of huge farms. Whereas if you took away the subsidies of the rails and the interstate highway system, you would have more local farming. You would have population centers closer to the food because it would be cheaper to get it there. So I do feel like there is a network of policy choices, and whether they were intentional or not, that exacerbated this problem.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting part about this, because there definitely were subsidies from the government to build the Transcontinental Railroad, for example. They gave them easements, they gave them land. They were able to sell the land along the railroad tracks to raise the money to build the railroads.
And the
A lot of
bonds were very cheap.
I'm sorry?
They subsidized the financing as well.
Yeah, and the bonds were subsidized, right? So there was already this idea out there in the marketplace of ideas in the 1800s for farmers to say, well, if you're going to do this for the railroad guys, why don't you do that for us? That was one of the arguments. The other side of that is a lot of the railroads that were built in the Northeast that were profitable early on were not necessarily built with those subsidies, and some of those railroads got pretty big pretty quickly. So there was kind of, for the big railroad barons, the robber barons, some of them got their money because the government really helped them out. Some of them because they had great ideas and built great railroads that were very, very productive and advanced the United States.
That was always my default position. And then when I saw some of like what Rockefeller did to defraud some small oil guys out of their positions, then I said, okay, these are maybe I always defended the robber barons, but if they were really they weren't robbing the people by selling them stuff they wanted. They were robbing competitors from their rights against fraud and that kind of thing. So I agree. It's definitely a mixed bag.
Yeah. So yeah, some of them got a lot of help from the government. Some of them were just very anti-competitive businessmen naturally based on the rules they had at the time, and some of them were just darn good businessmen. So all this was going on at the same time. So ultimately, what was key about the populist movement in the late 1800s that kind of made it distinct, the book you and I talked about, The Populist Moment. So the author from that book, basically The Populist Moment by Lawrence Goodwin. First of all, footnote to this conversation: the guy is a 1970s academic lefty. That's how it's written.
I wasn't advocating the book so much, but it is, it does introduce you to their side. Like, the person who told me to get this book was a rare breed these days of like a genuine intellectual lefty who just believes in this ideology and sees the corruption in the world today that is based on that ideology not being executed in good faith. But I thought it's interesting. You kind of have to have their side of the story. So I didn't mind that he was the lefty.
Yeah. And so reading that book since the last time you and I talked, he talks a lot about the farmers were facing the hierarchical found culture that they were engaged in, that they were having to climb up the hill against the accepted culture of their time. A lot of the same kind of stuff we're hearing people talk about now.
Was that valid in your opinion, his assessment about the hierarchy and culture? Because that's a theme of everybody who talks about the populist stuff. And I just wonder if that rang true to you.
So that terminology I kind of had to parse through and translate. It was 1970s academic lefty talk. But what are we really talking about? And so I think the fair discussion to have about the farmers in the late 1800s and other democratic movements throughout time is, are there really institutions and laws in place that protect the business interest or the rich people to the detriment of the poor people, to make it an unfair playing field? I think that's really the fair question. And the how do you overcome those problems in a democratic way, or in a way that's in a constitutional republic. And a lot of what the populists were about was, it was kind of the first moment in America when, instead of thinking of ourselves as a constitutional republic and we trust our betters, it was a lot of working class people, especially the farmers. And they did a little, they engaged a lot eventually with the Knights of Labor, which was the early version of the labor unions, to have the idea that, hey, it's a democracy, our vote counts too. What can we do to make the country better, work for us, preserve our way of life by using the power of the ballot? And that was essentially the new idea that came through in American politics and populism. A couple things they were fighting against, I think, are important to note that end up playing into what ultimately happened to the populist movement. A big one is, in the 1800s, I mean, 1860s, 70s, and 80s, and into the 1890s, if you were in the South and people were trying to convince you to leave the Democrat Party and join the Populist Party, basically the answer was, wait a minute, the Democrats were the ones that that was the party of our fathers. That was the party that my dad went to go fight at Gettysburg and was killed for going to. That the Democrats are what we always believe in. And if I'm not a Democrat, my neighbors are going to think I'm a traitor. They're going to think I'm supporting the Republicans, or that I'm just not supporting, the whole traditions of our culture down here. If you went up north, it was exactly the opposite. You want me to leave the Republican Party, the party that saved the Union, the party that freed the slaves, the party that we still go to the grand old Republic and meetings where it's all the Union veterans and their sons who really being a Republican means being in favor of the Union and being in favor of winning the Civil War. That whole concept was basically, if you tried to leave the Republican Party in the North or the Democrat Party in the South, the people who tried to stop you from doing that, they called it waving the bloody shirt. All that blood that was wasted, and now you're going to try to leave that. So that's what
both sides, right? Both sides kind of
both sides did it. And there were some rare exceptions in the late 1880s and early 1890s where people started to go against that, but it didn't ultimately succeed.
So this was pivotal in locking in the two-party system eventually, right? I mean, it seems to me like the biggest, the most divisive issue there ever could have been in our history to make that two-party system, intractable, would have been that, where you lost your sons.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. That the two parties, so the Republicans were a brand new party in the 1850s. Before that, it was the Democrats and the Whigs. The Whigs kind of fell apart. The Republicans came in as the party of mostly of freedom of the slaves. They had some fights over tariffs, and tariffs were really important back then because we didn't have an income tax yet. And so there were fights over that. But mostly, other than the question of slavery and union, there really were not dramatic differences between Republicans and Democrats when it came to, for example, economic policy. They were a lot more laissez-faire. Both sides were fairly conservative on religious issues. They were fairly conservative on economic issues. They both were willing to engage in some protectionism of big business about equally. If you were to describe the business approach to the Democrat Party and the business approach to the Republican Party in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, what do you think the difference was? Nothing.
The Democrats versus the business policy. Yeah, I mean, it sounds to me like there was no business policy at the government level until that came later.
Yeah, I mean, or they just didn't disagree with each other very much.
What was it? What was the policy? What were policies?
So a lot of the policies in the late 1800s were using the terminology of laissez-faire, using the terminology of capitalism, using the terminology of having no policy, but in reality, sort of putting in place some policies that favored big business and big industry. The Interstate Commerce Commission was founded in the 1880s, and it was supposed to begin regulating the railroads. It was the first of the big administrative agencies, and the
end of the Constitution.
Yeah, sort of the end of the Constitution in some ways. The right to regulate interstate commerce is in the Constitution, and the Congress has the right to do that. So here's one of the examples of the things that were changing in that time period in the 1880s and 1890s. The Reading Railroad alone had 100,000 employees and was the largest corporation in the United States by the 1880s.
That's
and it
amazing.
covered something like 17 states. So if you go back to
Wow.
the way the government ran in the 1870s and 1880s, there was no government that had control over that railroad. There was no government that could regulate. Each state had their own rules, so each state had to regulate the piece of that railroad that was in their state. So if they wanted to pass a safety rule, maybe they could, but it would only apply within that state. So, and what if somebody wanted to say regulate the rates of railroads, for example? Now, you and I, as libertarians, are not necessarily in favor of regulating the rates of railroads,
It's
but
tricky
could a
though if you gave them easements and subsidies like that equals you gave them tax dollars there.
yeah, exactly. If we're going to give you tax dollars, then you have to agree to ship the wheat for no more than 5 cents a bushel or
Get it.
whatever it is, or 3 cents, whatever the cost is. And so but who's going to do that? And the federal government, until the Interstate Commerce Commission, didn't have anybody who was really doing that. So they came along and they were supposed to regulate railroad rates. And they did it kind of minimally at first. It wasn't exactly that helpful. This is one reason the populist movement kind of really got going, and say, well, that's a good idea. Now actually do it. And that's what they wanted the government to do, was really regulate railroads.
And how sympathetic are you to their cause?
From a constitutional point of view, I think they have a point that their votes should count. And I think they have every right to organize. They have every right to try to teach themselves a better system. They have every right to have their own leaders. And if they want to form a third party, have at it. If the policy positions of your third party are a bunch of big government ideas of expanding the government, you need to do that by amending the Constitution. And that's actually started with eventually what they pushed forward.
I know, but that you really don't want. I mean, that's not good enough for me. Like, I hear what you're saying. Like, it's unconstitutional. It's therefore illegal and uncontemplatable short of an amendment. But an amendment like that would so fundamentally change the structure, because you would have to have more authority, more enforcement, more taxation, and none of which really lives in the Constitution.
Yeah, and
Yeah, it would have a lot of implications.
yeah, so that's ultimately how we get to the progressive era, which really
Okay.
starts with Teddy
I'm not
Roosevelt in
gonna
1900.
I always jump your gun. I'm not doing it.
Yeah, so
Get back.
let's kind of talk a little, wrap up this about the
Yeah.
populist movement, just to kind of cover this very quickly. So by 1892, they put up their own candidate, and their own candidate in 1892
Oh, yeah.
got like 8 states to vote for him.
Was it Tom Watson?
It was, let me make sure I get it right.
There was I think a guy who actually had been a congressman.
It was James Weaver.
Oh.
He got James Weaver got 22 electoral votes. Benjamin Harrison got 145, and Grover Cleveland got 277 electoral votes. Grover Cleveland won. Here's a trivia question for you, real quick. While we stop right here. Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860 as a Republican, first Republican elected. Republican Party came out of nowhere right before the Civil War. He gets elected. Andrew Johnson, as his vice president, was a Democrat, and in 1864 he ran under the National Union Party by having a vice president as a Democrat in order to get Democrat votes to support
so
him.
it had already, because at one point the vice president and the president were elected separately, but this
that
was
had already gone away. The Constitution had already been amended. They ran on the same ticket, and the idea was to have a combined ticket. So when President Lincoln was shot, a Democrat became president, which led to all kinds of trouble, and Andrew Johnson was impeached, and he wanted to be soft on the South and all kinds of history. I'll skip over that for a second. Between Abraham Lincoln and Woodrow Wilson being elected in 1912, how many Democrats were elected to the presidency?
Since before Wilson,
from Abraham Lincoln
elected.
in 1860,
So was Andrew Johnson never
was not elected because
Okay,
he only served out one term basically.
Ford wasn't even elected to VP. So
Right.
Okay, so Jefferson was a Democrat.
I'm talking about after Abraham Lincoln.
Okay. Oh, after Abraham Lincoln.
So Abraham Lincoln was followed by
Teddy
Johnson.
Roosevelt?
Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican.
Oh, cool. Right. Okay. I don't know. I guess none. None.
The answer was one president twice, Grover Cleveland. So my
Really?
point
What
is
was
from
he up to? He's one of those he has to be a great one because I never heard anything he ever did.
he was actually probably the most libertarian president we had in the 1800s.
Yeah, I believe it.
I would argue that he was maybe the most libertarian president we ever had. And so when he ran for office, he got elected when the Republicans were kind of having internal fighting. He lost the next election, and then he ran again, and so he served two separate terms. The end of his second term was the 1896 election. So as his term is ending, he's basically a libertarian Democrat, and but what they called them back then was they called them bourbon Democrats. And a
Okay.
bourbon Democrat, they also called
In
them
the
gold
South.
Democrats. He was
But
for a strong gold-backed dollar and very small government, reducing the tariff
Nice.
rates, those kind of things.
I think I'm a Grover Cleveland Democrat. I'm going to call myself a Grover
Yeah,
Cleveland.
it's actually a pretty good. That's the title. So in 1892, the Populists put up James Weaver, who wins 22 electoral votes. Not a whole lot going on, but the Democrats in the South managed to convince most of the populist-leaning farmers to vote for them, and so you started having Southern Democrats who were at least using the populist words, at least saying that we need more regulation of the railroads, that we need fiat dollars. We need dollars that are not backed by gold. We need more silver-based coinage. And as they were convincing more and more people in the Democrat Party to at least mouth those words, what happened in 1896 was that the Democratic National Convention, remember at the time the Democrats are both parties at their national conventions, they're not doing any kind of primaries. You basically vote when you get there, and it's an old boys club of people voting. And when they get there, it goes through multiple ballots, and finally, this guy named William Jennings Bryan stands up, and he gives this speech that concludes with him holding out his arms like he's Jesus on the cross and says, "You shall not crucify man upon a cross of gold." The famous William Jennings cross of gold speech. That so impresses the Democrats who are there that they nominate him, and that so impresses the populists when they hear about it that they nominate him to be their candidate, and they combine both. Basically, the populists all become Democrats. He loses to William McKinley in the election of 1896. McKinley serves for a little over a term, and just barely into a second term, he's shot, and Teddy Roosevelt becomes president.
Why was he shot? Oh, Teddy Roosevelt was his vice president?
And Teddy Roosevelt was
That
his
might
vice
explain
president.
it.
McKinley was shot by an anarchist while he was at the World's
Oh,
Fair.
come on. They always pin it on the anarchists. I don't
Yeah.
know. I don't know if Teddy was benefiting. Anyway, that's probably out there. I'll take that
Yeah.
back. I'll take that back.
So the populace. So at that point, when the populace combined with the Democrats, it became really accepted in politics at the time. Both parties sort of became reform parties. They became more progressive. They wanted to address the problems of the little guy. They wanted to address the problems of the excesses of business. They both recognized that there were a lot of voters out there that were not happy with the way that things were going. So let's just kind of just set the stage a little bit for this time period. The population of the United States at the end of the Civil War was 36 million. By 1900, it was 78 million. It had basically doubled. This time period was, Mark Twain called it the Gilded Age. He did not mean that as a compliment.
Right.
He meant that as it looks really pretty on the outside because these rich people are building these nice houses, but it's all founded on basically you're spray painting gold, you're painting gold paint on some really ugly stuff because businesses were kind of pretty corrupt on the inside, was his argument. By 1900, you had Upton Sinclair write his book, The Jungle, about how dangerous and gross the meatpacking industry was in Chicago.
I've heard that either that was way exaggerated or way undersaturated. Like I've heard that it's one or the other. Do you have an opinion?
Yeah, my opinion is he was a socialist, and he was specifically writing that to try to bring in more regulation. And he certainly did sway public opinion. I have also heard stories about how bad the butcher shops in the butcher industry was around that time, that it was pretty darn gross. I
think that book is where like It's like Rasputin, the murder of Rasputin. Like he gets shot, he gets hit in the head, he gets drowned, he gets starved. Like everything happens to this one guy.
Yeah.
So I'm sure it told a deeper truth. Facts are facts, but truth is truth. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it was yucky. I guess I don't know. It's hard for me because I'm such a free market true believer. And when I see the cultural fallout of the things that are attributed to capitalism, like nowadays, and I feel like, but so much of that is because it isn't actually a free market. It isn't where you could butcher, like here, like pot and stuff. They make it legal and then they put a bunch of regulations on it. So you're not just growing it in your backyard. You end up going to the store and getting like this concentrated vape stuff. Like I feel like sometimes even now they don't let certain people in certain places slaughter their own animals where it might be more natural and even more sanitary in many respects. You have to use industrial farming. It's cheaper. It's more facilitated by policy to use industrial farming. So I always want to dig into the things that we consider to be, basic facts on that stuff. Not you. I'm not asking you to do it, but
Yeah,
for me.
and I'm totally with you. So letting small farmers and people kill their own chickens to do what they want to with it is one thing, and overregulating that is a big deal. But when we're talking about whole giant, factory settings in Chicago where it was acres and acres and acres of people working really, really tough hours, he may have had a point. So was it really true? I'm not the expert on that, but my point is, during that age, it was certainly politically influencing that was the narrative that was being created.
Yeah, and I do believe I'm starting to dig into this, the enclosure period in England, where it intentionally, I think, whatever, I won't get into that. But one of the things that this disruptive policy did was drive small farmers into the cities, which provided industrial labor. So it is possible that squeezing out that the corporate interests wouldn't want to help those small farmers that were having these problems to the extent that, and that's what I get out of this book maybe a little bit, is that there was a top heavy politics that it would be in everybody's interest to make sure that those farmers yield to big farms and then move into the city so that there isn't this huge population in the farmlands. Rather, they're in there to be or have to be forced to the big farms to work for somebody else. It is possible that there was.
I'm not sure that there was that big a conspiracy to that it made that ultimately happened. Is certainly what
everyone's interests, like you don't have to conspire if your interests align and you have power,
right?
And all roads point to little people at big farms,
right? And the counterpoint I was going to make is the interest of the merchant class and the railroad class was to have all these farmers out there continue doing what they were doing and basically not making much of a living, but providing them these commodities that they could go sell on the market, while at the same time the merchants could sell their sugar and their coffee and their molasses and whatever, shoes and whatever else they sold at the general store for a significantly higher price and plus interest than what they could sell to somebody who just walked in with cash. And so it was made their business. The merchants in the small the small agricultural communities were making a lot of money. They weren't all Mr. Olson on the Little House on the Prairie. It was all Mrs. Olson running all those businesses and being very, very strict, Ebenezer Scrooge-like when it came to, collecting the interest and making all the and doing all the forcing people to pay stuff and then taking a lien against their crops if they didn't pay. I just want to kind of just to set up a couple other things for this time frame. A lot of people also call this the second industrial revolution. And if you think about the dramatic changes in technology, we think about that now, how things are changing. But there were 440,000 patents issued in the United States between 1870 and 1900.
Wow. It reminds me of the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, so it's a dramatic increase in the power of industry. Thomas Edison was around at this time. So at the Civil War ended, if you wanted to stay up late reading a book, you had to have a candle or a lantern.
Yeah. Thomas Edison was a piece of crap, just so you know.
Sorry?
Thomas Edison was a piece of crap.
There's a lot of stories about it. But on the other hand, his laboratory, the Menlo Park, New Jersey laboratory, did produce a lot of stuff that changed how Americans lived. And
Okay,
whether
it
it was
wasn't
whether
just
he stole some of
Westinghouse and
that or not is
Tesla.
a whole
Yeah.
different story.
Okay, I'm
The
talking
point
about the Westinghouse Tesla stuff. The electricity, his wasn't as good, and there was all sorts of. I mean, I think it's well established he killed that elephant, but I think he was a bad guy. But yeah, okay, it doesn't mean he didn't add some value, but just
whether it was him or not, think about those things that happened during that time period. It was and I'm sorry, there's a fire engine going by outside. The if you at the end of the Civil War, if you wanted to stay up after dark, you had to light a candle or a lantern, and what that was tough to do. Most people lived dawn to dusk, and then you went to bed at night because you didn't have much reading light. By 1900, a lot of cities had electricity, and the light bulb was out there. The telephone got invented during this time period.
I
The
have to.
telegraph.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I have to say it did occur to me that if we didn't have electricity and could not read so much, we could not be propagandized as much. You can go back like there are people whu will just reductio ad absurdum where you can just keep going back and it's kind of like Ted Kaczynski, just go back and back and back to where like the fall of man is the invention of fire or something. But
So to that point, on one counterpoint is because these farmers were fairly literate, they eventually had their own newspapers that were they were self-educating. They had people going around who would actually teach the farmers about economics and about the government and what the Constitution said and how we might be able to use the government arguably to do certain things for us. The modern term for them, I would call them community organizers. That's essentially what they had going on. They had their own education system, they had their own newspapers. But
alt
to your
media,
point, I'm sorry?
alt media.
Yeah. But to your point, what was the mainstream media called in the 1880s and 1890s and early 1900s? It was yellow journalism. This is the time period of William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer. They both dramatically grew their circulation for the newspapers and made crap tons of money themselves by basically, it was called muckraking. They had a name for it back then. It was, now we call it fake news. Back then it was called muckraking. It's kind of the same concept. So there's a lot of kind of similarities between back then and today in terms of technologies dramatically changing. There's questions about what the role of the government should be. There's questions about, how should we rein in the media? Should we do something about them? Should we have our own sources of news? That's a big part of what Populist actually did that I kind of do like, is if you're going to start your own institutions, start your own institutions legally under the law.
Yeah, I mean, they maybe were on that path, but like all alt media, it's going to get hijacked, and those avenues of influence. I mean, that's how even movie theaters in small towns, they had to have those censorship laws so that people would accept it. The internet was a limited hangout for a long time. We could get the real truth out of the internet, and now everybody's on it. They get the real truth from us on Facebook and stuff, everything about our lives, but we no longer get it from them. So it's a wedge. In the beginning, I'm sure it had to have value or people wouldn't see any value in it.
Yeah. And so what ultimately happened? Well, more and more media sources were out there that eventually were able to kind of fight back. But there's also, so for example, Joseph Pulitzer had a change of heart. He eventually funded the journalism department at Columbia, which for a long time actually was pretty solid on objective journalism, although more modern trends, I think they've been influenced again. But we went through this cycle where we had muckraking yellow journalism, and then we developed the idea of professional journalism. Eventually evolved out of that. It took a couple decades, but it eventually evolved out of that.
So let's get to where I'm interested. I feel like populism was hijacked or redirected into progressivism. I always smelled a rat with progressivism, which is how I discovered this book, The Populist Moment, because I mentioned that to my erudite liberal friend, and he was like, yeah, it's not progressivism that was the answer. It was populism. And I always felt like maybe progressivism was a way that big business got themselves regulated to where they don't even get competition. I always felt progressivism was a huge trap. And I'm interested to know if they were inspired by populism or if it was an answer to populism, like a trap. Like I feel like Marx and the Russian Revolution and all that stuff was just, there was going to be another populist moment. So they converted it into something that was even more power concentrated at the top.
Yeah, so I think it was both. I think the populism was forcing the government to start to look at whether or not we need to change our laws to protect the little guy or provide some more opportunities and rein in big business, and whether or not that needed to be done with less benefits given to big business, or actually having new regulation to balance out the regulation that they had done to old business. And eventually, what happened was that the Democrats put up William Jennings Bryan. He ended up running 3 different times as the Democrat candidate, and he ran on these very populist platforms, including the idea of silver money and fiat money. A lot of that kind of calmed down when the Klondike Gold Rush produced enough gold that the money supply ended up being less of a problem. So then the real problem became, well, what do we do about these big corporations, the giant trusts, where the railroads all agreed to collude to maintain the same rates? And Teddy Roosevelt came along with what he called the square deal. That was the first real progressivism. And the square deal was, he called it the 3 C's. It was consumer protection, corporate regulation, and conservation. And so the idea of corporate regulation reining in these big corporations that would never exist if government didn't first give them the benefit of having the protections of a corporation. Consumer protections, there should be some laws to balance the playing field, that if corporations are doing stuff that's bad, that consumers should have the right to sue and have people protect them.
I would argue that those are torts. They're in common law.
You and I are on the same page that if the court system work properly, you should be able to sue big corporations using tort law, and maybe breach of contract law, depending on what's work.
Yeah, there's lots of things
on the situation. Yeah. So ultimately, that's kind of how progressivism got its foot in the door, was Teddy Roosevelt kind of being mild on, let's have some regulations but still protect big business. And just the industrialization of the age and the idea that all these businesses had all these advantages, once that started to be part of the narrative, then there started to be this political fight of who can be most progressive and who can be most progressive and get elected. So Teddy Roosevelt gets reelected in 1904 on a progressive message that's kind of, we'd consider it today to be very moderate or low-level regulation, but still progressive. Taft wins in 1908, and he really draws back on progressivism. So in 1912, and this is kind of where I'd like to wrap it up, the big election that changed everything was Taft wanted to be low regulation. Teddy Roosevelt said, wait a minute, we need to have some moderate regulation of these big businesses. So he ended up running for the nomination again to become president again. He loses, so he forms a third party, the Progressive Party, or Bull Moose Party. They end up getting more votes than the Republicans, but they spread out the vote so much that the Democrat, with 41% of the popular vote, wins 400 electoral votes, and that's Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson's an academic who loves big government and loves the idea that we need a bunch of experts to run things better, and that's where progressivism really got its foothold.
You don't think Teddy Roosevelt did that on purpose? I think he was totally corrupted. Woodrow Wilson brought us the Fed, the FBI, the war. I mean, I think Teddy Roosevelt was a setup.
If it wasn't a setup, it was, let's just say the least conspiratorial interpretation is his selfishness still created the gateway for Woodrow Wilson to get in there.
Yeah, I think that was a setup job, and what a horrible impact it had. So can we, maybe we can talk about progressivism another time, or we can talk about it now if you have time, but I don't think you do. And I wanted to just bring that to today, because I noticed, I felt it was totally inauthentic when during Trump's campaign in like 2015, there was all this talk about populism. It was coming to the right. It was Republican. And I felt like the way they were presenting it was so European to me. It felt so very like, well, these capitalists came from a feudal, they got their money, ill-gotten gains, and we need to use the power of government to get some of that back because there's no righting that wrong. That is such a European interpretation. Like, it's so not American. I would never expect that to come to Republicans. I felt like it was very manufactured. And I feel like it was they just used some of the buzzwords or sentiments of the populist era and brought it to today in that framework. And it was completely teed up, I think, in 2012, when there was a so-called leak from the Obama camp that said, we are giving up on the white working class. And I thought, why would they make that announcement? They called it a leak, but it was an announcement. And that was to tee up, in my opinion, this narrative to the right, which ultimately, oh, we have to talk about this if you have a minute, ultimately brought identity politics to the right, finally, after so many decades of that failing. And I will say one point that I've heard over and over again, I think is so interesting, really blew my mind, was that segregation was really foisted upon the South from on high in order to segregate the poor farmers who were uniting across color lines to have this grassroots power. So there's a few things
So
there.
yeah,
Answer what
you've
you
thrown a
want. We'll
lot
get
at me, and
I'm
Monica,
sorry.
I'm afraid I'm gonna have to run. I'm about out of time. So
Oh, okay. I thought
if
you
you don't
had till
mind,
half
yeah,
past.
let's save some of that for next time. Because let me wrap up a couple things, quick thoughts on that.
Okay.
In the progressive moment, they absolutely talk about that. The farmers in the South, the blacks started to organize under the Farmers Alliance too, and there was a serious push from some of those farmers on the white side to basically say, if we can get the black guys out here, we can end up actually having more votes for populism. And literally, the Democrat Party in Mississippi, for example, had the KKK go attack the populist newspapers and tear down their newspapers and basically put the strong arm on them. And then the rhetoric they used in more places was basically using the history of the Confederacy, the lost cause, and racism to essentially keep them separated. So that absolutely was part of it. And I think the other analogy that I would use to kind of wrap it up is, so the reason people are talking about populism and the idea that Obama saying we're not going to go after the white working class anymore is that backfired on them in 2016 with Trump getting elected. Trump essentially did successfully what William Jennings Bryan tried to do. He tried to bring in the populist base, this old working class base that had kind of lost a home in the Democratic Party, that had lost a home in the Republican Party back in the 1800s, that Trump brought in that working class, but managed to hold together enough traditional Republicans to have a coalition to win in 2016. William Jennings Bryan tried to do that by keeping traditional Democrats with the new populists in 1896 and 1900. The problem was, between the Republicans having the momentum, waving the bloody shirt, and Teddy Roosevelt being so popular, it just never worked out.
Well, that's very interesting. I always think of I've been thinking about the segregation issue as kind of a reverse cultural Marxism. I'm going to let you go, but I'm going to ask if maybe the next time we can get into progressivism, Woodrow Wilson, and the changes to the Constitution that were so pivotal. That was like the moment, I
That,
would
yeah,
think, of the biggest
absolutely.
changes in the Constitution. So you probably had all that prepared, but these, I'm never going to let you just cursory attack these things. I want to know everything. So thank you so much for your extra time.
Absolutely, Monica. I look forward to talking about that stuff. That'd be great. Sorry I have to run.
Great. Let's do it next
Okay.
time. Thanks so
Okay.
much, Eric.
Appreciate
This
it.
is Eric Buchanan, and you have been listening to Live Dives.
Thanks, Monica.